My name is Nyleen. I'm 31 years old. I'm a strategic risk analyst for the Department of Defense. My job, the one I've spent a decade perfecting, is to quantify chaos and predict the unpredictable for the sake of national security. I deal in spreadsheets of probability, assessing the structural integrity of systems across the globe. But at 2:14 a.m. on a rainy Tuesday in Seattle, as I sat on my cold kitchen floor, the one variable I failed to account for was the total collapse of my own body. The sound of a phone sliding across hardwood is surprisingly loud when the house is empty. It's a dry, rattling noise that somehow cut through the heavy drumming of the Pacific Northwest rain against the window pane. I didn't scream. Risk analysts don't scream. We process. I felt the sharp, metallic tang of iron on the back of my tongue, the taste of a blood pressure that was no longer compatible with a healthy pregnancy. My vision, usually my most reliable tool, began to betray me. It started as a pulsing silver fog at the edges of my sight, narrowing my world until the living room lamp was just a smudge star in a sea of ink. Preeclampsia. I knew the data. I knew the mortality rates. I knew the exact window of intervention required to save both the life inside me and the one currently fading on the floor. I felt the weight of my son, a 6-pound miracle I was meant to protect, and the crushing irony that I, a woman who secures the interests of a superpower, couldn't even secure the integrity of my own living room floor. I had spent years being the load-bearing wall for a family that didn't know how to stand on its own, and now, when the ceiling was coming down, I was entirely alone. Gentry was on a classified mission, a reality of our life that I had accepted long ago. He was halfway across the world, serving a country that would provide him a medal but couldn't provide him a way home in time for this. I used the voice command on my phone. My tongue felt heavy, like it was made of wet wool. "Call Mom!" The phone rang 3 times. When the line picked up, the background noise wasn't the silence of a sleeping house. It was the sharp, bright clink of champagne flutes and the muffled, upbeat rhythm of a high-end bridal showroom. I could almost smell the expensive jasmine candles through the speaker. "Mom," I whispered, my cheek pressed against the cold tiles. "I can't see. My vision is gone. I'm having a crisis. I think it's the blood pressure. Gentry is on a mission. I need you to come to the house, now." There was a pause. Not a pause of panic or even concern. It was a long, audible sigh of profound annoyance. I heard my mother, Indira, move away from a conversation. "Nyleen, enough," she said, her voice sharp with the kind of condescension you'd use for a petulant toddler. "We are at Celine's final fitting. Caspian's parents flew in specifically for this, and we are right in the middle of a toast. Do not try to steal your sister's spotlight with another one of your emergencies just because Gentry isn't there to hold your hand." "Mom, I'm serious. I'm on the floor. I can't." "You're dehydrated from overworking at that government desk, Nyleen. You always did have a flair for the dramatic when Celine has something important going on. Drink some orange juice and lie down. We'll check on you tomorrow after the brunch. Don't ruin the photos by making your father worry." The line went dead. The line went. The dial tone that followed wasn't just a sound. It was the final definitive snap of a cord that had been fraying for 31 years. In my line of work, we have a term: signal-to-noise ratio. For years, I had treated my family's needs as the signal and my own well-being as the noise. I had paid their taxes, settled their debts, and kept their glass house in Bellevue from shattering, all while they viewed me as a convenient, invisible utility. But as I lay there in the dark, my vision a flickering mess of gray and white, the analyst took over. The daughter died on that kitchen floor, but the specialist survived. I didn't call her back. I didn't waste oxygen on a second plea. I used the voice command again, this time calling a private, high-tier medical transport service I had retained through my DoD benefits, a service I paid for out of my own pocket and had never once mentioned to them. "Transport required. High priority. Preeclampsia protocol. Madigan Army Medical Center." By the time the paramedics arrived, I was in a state of clinical detachment. The veteran driver found me, his hand steady and silent as he lifted me onto the gurney. He saw the blood on the floor, the dark room, and the phone on the counter still glowing with a call-ended notification from Mom. He didn't ask questions. He just worked. As the ambulance doors slammed shut and the sirens began to wail against the Seattle rain, my vision started to return in jagged, painful flashes. I reached for my phone. My hands were shaking, but my mind was a steel trap. I opened my banking app. I saw the pending authorization for the $5,000 deposit at the bridal showroom, a charge on my secondary credit card that Elowen used as if it were her own. I hit cancel. I moved to the escrow account for the Bellevue house, the mortgage I had been quietly paying for 2 years while Indira told her friends it was family wealth. I initiated a hold for audit and locked the access. I wasn't being cruel. I was simply withdrawing my resources from a system that had failed its primary function. A single dial tone had taught me more about risk than a decade at the Pentagon. I had spent my life building a fortress for people who wouldn't even open the door for me during a storm. The ambulance screeched to a halt at the Madigan ER. The doors flew open to a world of red lights and shouting nurses. My phone buzzed in my hand. A text from Indira. "Caspian says you're being dramatic. Seriously, don't ruin the photos." I looked at the message, then handed the phone to the intake nurse. "Archive this," I said, my voice finally finding its edge. "I didn't ruin the photos. I just stopped paying for the camera." Now, let me take you back to the fall of 2023. Seattle was draped in its usual gray curtain of rain, and I was sitting in my office at the Department of Defense, staring at a satellite feed that made more sense than my own family. My job involves identifying structural vulnerabilities in foreign infrastructures. But that morning, I realized I had spent my entire life ignoring the cracks in my own foundation. You see, the events of that rainy Tuesday on my kitchen floor weren't a freak accident. They were the inevitable conclusion of a 30-year trajectory. In the Marshall household, love was never a gift. It was a zero-sum game. There was a limited supply of affection, and every ounce of it had been allocated to my older sister, Elowen, long before I was even a thought in the room. My parents, Indira and Thatcher, didn't value character or integrity. They valued the image of success, the right zip code in Bellevue, the right pedigree, and the kind of high-maintenance beauty that requires a team of people to maintain. Elowen was the art piece. She was curated, ethereal, and perpetually destined for greatness. My parents didn't raise her. They managed her public relations. I, on the other hand, was the structural support. I was practical, silent, and entirely invisible until something needed fixing. There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes with being the load-bearing wall of a family. No one ever compliments the foundation until the basement floods. Elowen was the dream they wanted to have. I was the alarm clock that kept waking them up to the reality of their bills. She was celebrated, I was managed. By late September, the system reached a critical failure point. Though I was the only one looking at the data, part of my invisible labor was managing the family's emergency digital mail, a task Indira had offloaded onto me years ago, claiming she didn't understand the cloud. What she really meant was she didn't want to see the debt she was accumulating. I found the tax lien notice on a Tuesday. The Bellevue house, the pristine white colonial that served as the stage for every one of my mother's social triumphs, was $15,000 behind in property taxes. The city was weeks away from initiating a foreclosure. My parents were on the verge of losing the very roof they used to look down on me. I didn't call a family meeting. I didn't ask for a thank you. I logged into my private bonus account, money I had earned through 18 months of grueling overtime on a cybersecurity project, and I hit submit. I watched the $15,000 transfer in a blink. The paid in full notification popped up, and for a moment, I felt a quiet sense of safety. I thought I had bought us some peace. That evening I drove to Bellevue for our weekly dinner. I brought a bottle of Pinot Noir, a vintage I knew my father liked. As I set it on the mahogany sideboard, my mother glanced at it and sighed. "Nyleen, really? This vintage is a bit thin, don't you think?" Indira said, not looking at me as she adjusted the centerpieces. "Elowen brought that wonderful Cabernet last week. She has such an intuitive sense for the finer things. It's a shame you're always so focused on the bargain bin." Thatcher looked at me over the rim of his glasses, his disappointment as practiced as his handshake. "Nyleen, your mother's birthday was last week. You sent a card, just a card." Elowen took us to that new bistro in Madison Park. She actually cares about our milestones. You're just so preoccupied with your little government desk job. You lack a certain presence. I sat there, the weight of the $15,000 receipt sitting in my mental pocket like a lead weight. I didn't mention the tax lien. I didn't mention that the new bistro Elowen took them to had likely been paid for with a credit card I was currently subsidizing. I just took a sip of the thin wine and nodded. "I'll try to do better, Dad," I said. It was a lie, but in that house, lies were the only currency that didn't bounce. The price of peace is often paid by those who cherish it most. I told myself I could endure it. I told myself that if I held firm to the current structure, they would eventually see the effort I was putting in. But exploitation, the taking advantage, was not just emotional. It was systemic. A week later, a fraud alert hit my phone during a high-level briefing. A new credit line had been opened in my name. The billing address? 4200 Bellevue Way, my parents' home. I logged into the portal under the table. The charges were already rolling in. Luxury bridal magazines, a $1,200 deposit at a high-end spa, and a series of consultation fees for a wedding planner. Elowen was building her perfect life using my identity as the raw material. I should have called the police. I should have frozen her world right then. But I looked at my phone and remembered the way my mother's face lit up when she talked about Elowen's perfect fiancé, Caspian. I told myself that if Elowen got married, she would finally be someone else's responsibility. I rationalized it as an investment in my own future freedom. I could handle a few points off my credit score if it meant buying my way out of their constant demands. "It's just numbers," I whispered to myself. But as a risk analyst, I should have known that numbers don't lie, even when people do. I opened a secure, encrypted folder on my DoD drive, a folder I labeled Project Marshall. I didn't delete the fraud alerts. I didn't confront her. I archived them. I saved the timestamps. I screenshotted the IP addresses. One day, I thought, the audit will come, and I will be the only one who knows where the bodies are buried. 1 month before the incident, the atmosphere in our family underwent a curious shift. In my line of work, we call it a temperature swing, a sudden tactical warmth designed to make the target lower their guard. It started with a text from Indira, not a demand for a password or a complaint about a bill, but a simple, "Thinking of you, honey. Brunch this Sunday?" I remember staring at the screen of my phone for a long time. I was sitting in my car in the rain, the heater hummin', feeling the hollow ache of Gentry's absence. He had been gone for 3 weeks on a deployment he couldn't name, and the silence of our apartment was starting to feel like a physical weight. I know now that I was vulnerable, and in the Marshall house, vulnerability was always treated as an opportunity for harvesting. Sunday brunch at the Bellevue house was a masterpiece of domestic theater. The smell of expensive jasmine tea and freshly baked croissants filled the sunroom. Caspian was there, draped in a cashmere sweater that cost more than my monthly mortgage. For the first time, he didn't treat me like the invisible tech support. He looked at me. He listened. "Your work sounds fascinating, Nyleen," Caspian said, leaning in. He didn't ask for secrets. He asked about the weight of it. He asked about the protocols of my commute, the security at the DoD annex, and whether I ever felt overwhelmed by the responsibility. He even remembered that I take my coffee black with a single cube of raw sugar. It's a powerful thing to be seen when you've spent your life being a shadow. I told him more than I should have, not about the data, but about the exhaustion. I thought he was finally recognizing my humanity, validating the invisible labor I performed for the country. I didn't realize I was handing a predator the architectural plans to my own defense systems. At the time, I didn't see the harvest. I just felt the sun. The first ask happened near the end of the meal, just as the mimosas were being poured. Indira pulled me into the kitchen, her hand resting gently on my forearm, a rare gesture of affection that made my pulse skip. "Nyleen, honey," she whispered, her eyes brimming with a soft, practiced desperation. Caspian's overseas assets are temporarily tied up in a merger. It's a bureaucracy thing, you know? But Elowen's down payment for that designer gown is due tomorrow. It's $5,000. Just this once, honey. Only for 30 days until his wire clears. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. I looked at my bank balance, my savings for the baby's nursery. But then I looked at my mother's hopeful face and the way Elowen was laughing with Caspian in the other room. I wanted to keep that laughter going. I wanted to be the daughter they were proud of, not just the one they tolerated. Just this once, I echoed. My finger trembled slightly as I initiated the wire transfer. The cold light of the banking app felt like an intruder in that warm kitchen. Transaction complete. I told myself I was helping. I told myself I was buying a ticket into the family circle. But just this once is the gateway drug of exploitation. Within 2 weeks, the requests became a recurring rhythm. The $5,000 gown deposit was followed by $2,000 for a brokerage fee Caspian needed. Then $1,500 for a private family dinner Indira insisted I host at a 5-star steakhouse. It was a process of ATM training, conditioning me to equate my value with my liquidity. By the end of October, I sat at my desk late at night, the blue light of my laptop the only thing keeping me awake. I opened a spreadsheet. Column A, date. Column B, recipient. Column C, reason. Column D, the lie. October 12th, $5,000, dress. October 19th, $2,000, assets. October 26th, $8,500, wedding venue deposit. The shock total at the bottom was $32,000. In 6 weeks, they had drained a third of my liquid security. I archived the statements in my encrypted DoD drive, right next to the fraud alerts from Elowen's spending. I shared the total with my father, Thatcher, hoping for some semblance of restraint. He just adjusted his silk tie and looked past me. "You're finally acting like a daughter, Nyleen," he said. The compliment had teeth. "It's nice to see you're not just a drone at that desk. Your money is finally doing something useful for people with actual potential, rather than just sitting in a stagnant account." It was a poisoned gift, praising my utility while negating my humanity. I realized then that to them, I wasn't a person. I was a resource. And resources don't have feelings. They only have capacity. The mask finally shattered on a Tuesday evening. I was leaving the DoD Annex parking lot, my mind already calculating the risk of a new security breach we'd detected. Caspian was leaning against my car, his cashmere sweater replaced by a sharp, dark overcoat. The orange glow of the parking lot lamps turned his eyes into something predatory. "Nyleen," he said, his voice dropping the brunch time charm. "I need a favor. There's a shell company, Aegis Logistics. Your department flagged one of its transfers today. I need you to bypass that flag. Just a glitch in the system." I stood my ground, my hand tightening on my bag. "I don't do glitches, Caspian. That's federal oversight. That's my career." He stepped closer, the smell of his expensive cologne now suffocating. "If I go down, Nyleen, Elowen goes with me. Her name is on the accounts I used for the wedding funds you've been subsidizing. If you don't clear that flag, the golden child spends her honeymoon in a federal cell. Do it for the family." I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I looked at him with the same blank, analytical expression I use for a corrupted data set. He didn't know that under my coat, my DoD-issued recorder was capturing every syllable of his extortion. "I'll see what I can do," I said quietly. He smiled, thinking he had finally broken me. He patted my shoulder and walked away into the shadows. I got into my car and locked the door, the mechanical thunk of the deadbolt sounding like a period at the end of a sentence. I had handed them the keys to my home. Now, Caspian wanted the keys to my country. As I drove home through the Seattle rain, I realized that the perfect fiancé was a Trojan horse, and my family had welcomed him in with open arms. I didn't know it yet, but the reckoning wasn't just coming. I was the one building the storm. A man who looks for a shadow only finds it when he's standing in the light. My family had kept me in the dark for so long they forgot that the dark is where you learn to see things others miss. Friday, 4:42 p.m. The fluorescent lights of the pharmacy on 4th Avenue hummed with a low-frequency buzz that felt like a needle vibrating against my temple. Outside, the Seattle sky was a bruised purple, and the evening commute was beginning to clog the streets with the smell of wet asphalt and exhaust. I stood at the counter, my fingers tracing the edge of my insurance card. I was 72 hours away from the night my vision would finally fail, But even then, the warning signs were flashing in my periphery. The mechanism of preeclampsia is a quiet, internal siege. It starts with a persistent throb behind the eyes and ends with the body turning against itself. I could feel the pressure behind my rib cage, a tight restrictive band that made every breath feel like a calculated effort. My ankles were swollen enough that my leather loafers felt 2 sizes too small. I just needed the medication, the labetalol that kept the red zone at bay. Elena, a pharmacist with tired eyes and a silver cross around her neck, swiped my card. We waited. In the world of high-frequency data, 3 seconds is an eternity. I heard the old dial-up groan of the insurance portal, then the sharp, rhythmic zip-clack of the thermal printer. Elena looked at the slip of paper, then back at the computer screen. She frowned, her head tilting in that universal gesture of bureaucratic confusion. She swiped it again. Same result. "I'm sorry, honey," Elena said, her voice dropping into that soft, apologetic register people use when they're about to deliver news that isn't their fault. "The primary policyholder withdrew your coverage yesterday, effective immediately. There's a note here in the system. Voluntary withdrawal of adult dependent. You're showing as uninsured." The hum of the lights seemed to grow louder. I was 31 years old, but because of a family trust arrangement my father had insisted on years ago to manage tax efficiencies, my medical coverage was tethered to the main Marshall policy. I paid the premiums every month into the family account, but Indira held the keys to the portal. I looked at the clock on the wall. 4:48 p.m. The pharmacy closed at 5 p.m. for the weekend. I had 12 minutes. I pulled out my phone. My hands didn't shake. They were just cold. I didn't call Indira's personal line. I knew she wouldn't answer while she was at the Bellevue estate preparing for Celine's engagement gala. Instead, I posted directly into the Marshall Family Celebration group thread. "Mom, my insurance was just terminated at the pharmacy. I'm at the counter and I need my medication. My BP is spiking. Was there a mistake with the policy update?" I watched the little icons appear at the bottom of the screen. Thatcher was seen. Eloin was seen. Indira was seen. A minute passed. Then the typing bubble appeared. A photo uploaded. It wasn't a policy number. It was a high-resolution shot of a Rolex submariner resting on a plush velvet cushion. The gold link reflected the chandelier light of the Bellevue sunroom. Indira's text followed. "Look what we finally got for Caspian. A proper watch for a proper man. We had to trim some unnecessary expenses from the family trust to afford the down payment for the jeweler. But it was worth it to see his face. We're doing the toast now." I stared at the gold watch. My labetalol cost $1,240 out of pocket without the negotiated insurance rate. Indira hadn't made a mistake. She had looked at the spreadsheet of our family's lives and decided that my heart medication was an unnecessary expense compared to the optics of Caspian's wrist. My phone buzzed again. Eloin. "Nyleen, quit blowing up Mom's phone. We're at a private vintage tasting. Stop being so dramatic about a headache. You work for the government. Figure it out." The little laughing emoji felt like a physical strike. I looked up. Elena was still standing there. She had leaned over the counter, her eyes fixed on my phone screen. She saw the Rolex. She saw the emoji. "I saw that," Elena whispered. Her face hardened, the tired look replaced by a sharp, protective clarity. She didn't say it was toxic or abusive. She just reached for the thermal printer and hit the print report button. "I'm printing the denial report with the exact timestamp and the reason for withdrawal. You're going to need this for your records, honey." She clipped the insurance denial form #882 to my prescription log. She pulled out a pen and wrote a note in the margin. "Patient in visible distress. BP 165 105ths. Primary policyholder terminated coverage 24 hours prior without notice." She stamped it with the pharmacy's official seal and pushed it toward me. "I'm a witness," she said. "If you ever need one." The clock hit 4:56 p.m. I reached into the hidden compartment of my bag and pulled out a black credit card, the one issued by the Department of Defense for emergency field expenses. It was meant for operational crises, and right now, my survival was the only operation that mattered. "Charge it," I said. "Out of pocket. Full price." The transaction went through with a clinical beep. $1,240. Elena handed me the bottle, her hand lingering on mine for a second. "Take care of yourself," she said, "because clearly no one else is going to." I walked out of the pharmacy and sat in my car. The rain was finally coming down in sheets, blurring the world outside my windshield. I sat there for 20 minutes, the pill bottle a cold weight in my lap. I looked at the family celebration thread one last time. They were posting photos of the appetizers now, prosciutto-wrapped asparagus and smoked salmon blinis. I didn't block them. I didn't send an angry reply. I just saved the screenshot of the Rolex next to the image of my denied insurance claim in the Project Marshall folder. A single truth settled in the silence of the car. Strangers in white coats and pharmacy aprons had shown more concern for my life in 10 minutes than the people I had spent a decade subsidizing. I had been convenient to them, like a light switch or a water heater. Now that I was asking for something back, I had been erased from the policy of their lives. Within 72 hours, I would be blind and bedridden in the kitchen. But when I took my first dose, an expensive medicine I had to pay for myself, I realized the door to my old house wasn't just closed. It was sealed from the inside. I woke up to a world that was no longer a silver fog, but a sharp, clinical white. The air in the recovery suite at Madigan Army Medical Center had a specific weight to it. The smell of industrial-grade lavender soap and the low, constant hum of the HVAC system that felt like the steady pulse of an institution that actually worked. I didn't reach for my eyes to see if my vision had returned. I simply lay there, listening to the rhythmic chirp hiss of the monitor beside my bed. The heavy feeling of the IV tube plugged into the back of my hand was like a grounding wire. My body was heavy and bruised after the emergency surgery, but the internal pressure, the tight constriction around my chest, had finally been broken. I was no longer a weight-bearing wall for anyone. I was just a patient. I had two choices on that hospital bed. I could wait for the system to discharge me back into the life that had almost ended me, or I could redesign the exit. In my world, when a system is compromised beyond repair, you don't keep patching it. You initiate a clean break. "Keep paying," I whispered to the empty room, "or stop the bleeding." The door opened with a quiet, hydraulic hiss. Dr. Eris Thorne walked in. He didn't look at me with the pitying eyes I had come to expect from the civilians in my family. He looked at me with the professional respect due to a Department of Defense colleague. He held a manila folder and my personal phone, which he had kept in a secure locker per military protocol. "The baby is in the NICU? Stable," Thorne said, his voice a calm anchor. "He's a fighter, Vance, like his mother. I've initiated the blackout protocol for your room. Given the circumstances of your admission and the documented neglect, no unauthorized visitors are permitted. Your family has been calling. I've directed them to the hospital's legal liaison." I nodded. The protection of the institution was a shield I had earned through a decade of service. I reached for my phone. It felt like a cold piece of evidence in my hand. I didn't check social media. I didn't check the missed calls from Indira. I opened my risk management dashboard, the custom interface I had built to track every financial tether I held. It was my proof object, #3. Looking at the screen, I saw them. The small, recurring green arrows representing the automatic transfers. $4,500 monthly to Sable Bridal Boutique for Elowin's installments. $1,200 for the Bellevue house maintenance fee. The Sapphire credit line, where Elowin was a secondary user, currently glowing with a fresh charge for a celebration brunch. They were a map of my own exploitation, a ledger of how I had allowed myself to be harvested. I felt a strange, detached clarity. I wasn't angry. I was an architect looking at a blueprint of a house built on sand. I began the cut. I canceled the recurring payment to the bridal boutique. I terminated Elowin's secondary access to the Sapphire line. I initiated a freeze for audit on the Bellevue property escrow account, a house I had been quietly paying for while my parents lived in the delusion of their own wealth. I changed my 2FA, two-factor authentication, and security keys, routing all confirmations to Gentry's secure military line. There were no tears. No dramatic speeches, just the soft, haptic click of a trackpad against my thumb. Each click felt like setting down a mountain I was never meant to carry. The silence that followed wasn't lonely, it was healing. A few minutes later, Dr. Thorne returned, carrying a cup of real coffee, not the watered-down cafeteria swill. He sat in the chair beside my bed for exactly 3 minutes. "How are you? Really?" he asked. I took a sip of the coffee. It was hot, bitter, and grounded. "Better," I said. For the first time in a decade, I'm the only one who knows where my resources are. I finally stopped negotiating with people who don't see me. He gave a single slow nod of understanding. He knew about the classified nature of Gentry's work, and he knew the cost of being the one left behind to manage the home front. Before he left, I checked my secure DoD email. A message from my director sat at the top of the inbox, marked with a level 4 encryption flag. "Take the time you need, Vance. We've flagged the Caspian file. The discrepancies you noted in the Aegis logistics audit have been confirmed. Gentry is closer than you think." A quiet strength began to settle in my marrow. I realized that my family hadn't noticed my absence yet because they hadn't tried to spend my money yet. They would notice the silence in their bank accounts long before they ever noticed the silence in my heart. I closed my laptop and looked out the window. The Tacoma skyline loomed sharply in the morning sun. I knew the consequences were imminent. I knew that when Darling tried to buy the next glass of champagne and found her card declined, screams would erupt from Bellevue. But I wasn't the one doing the cleaning anymore. I had spent my life building a fortress for people who wouldn't even open the door for me. Now I was building a cage for the person who had tried to burn my country down. I didn't know exactly what would happen when Gentry walked through that door, but I knew the board was set. I thought the silence would be the hard part, but as I looked at the account-locked notification on my screen, I realized the silence was the only thing that was real. The neonatal wing of Madigan Army Medical Center is the only place in Seattle where the world feels honest. At 4 a.m, the air is thin, tasting of unscented soap and the warm, milky scent of new skin. I sat in a high-backed rocker, my eyes fixed on the rhythmic rise and fall of my son's chest. He was a tiny, perfect engine, breathing with a cadence that finally gave my own pulse a reason to stabilize. My name is Nyleen Vance Marshall, and for the first time in 31 years, I wasn't calculating the risk of someone else's collapse. I was protecting the only asset that mattered. But the silence in the room was unsettling. I looked at the empty hospital chair beside me, a space that should have been occupied by family. The lingering pain was no longer a sharp ache. It was like a phantom limb, the heavy feeling of those whose limbs have been amputated by their own choices. On the bedside table, Gentry's heavy wedding ring reflected the hospital light. It was a golden circle symbolizing a life of darkness and endless voids, a life my mother and sister had scoffed at as unimportant. They had spent years calling him low-ranking soldier, a low-ranking soldier, because they lacked the authority to know that he was the very predator they welcomed into their dining room. The bridge call came at 7:58 p.m. on Tuesday. It wasn't a ringtone, it was a silent geofence alert on my secure DoD laptop. The Bellevue property, the white Colonial I still technically carried on my balance sheet, had just seen a massive spike in cellular activity. A message from a colleague in strategic risk flashed on the screen. "Guest list at the Bellevue house just peaked, Vance. Caspian is initiating the final wire. The board is live. Are you ready?" I stared at the blinking cursor. My family thought I was a broken woman in a hospital bed, a dramatic burden they had successfully erased from their insurance policy. They didn't realize that while I was healing, I was also watching. I wasn't just a mother now. I was the eyes in the sky. A house built on a lie cannot survive the wind, I thought. A quiet realization that wasn't about revenge, but about structural integrity. I had spent 5 years being the ghost in their machine. Tonight, I was going to be the glitch that brought it all down. 12 miles away, at 8:12 p.m., 3 black SUVs turned onto the rain-slicked cul-de-sac in Bellevue. They moved at a steady 60 miles per hour. No sirens, no flashing lights. Just the low, predatory hum of high-performance engines. Inside the glass house, the string quartet was playing Bach. My mother, Indira, was laughing, holding a glass of vintage Cristal that cost $300 a bottle. She was surrounded by guests who believed her story of a daughter's breakdown. The 3-beat knock was heavy enough to rattle the chandeliers. Thump, thump, thump. Indira opened the door, a practiced smile of social grace on her lips, likely expecting a late-arriving donor or perhaps more champagne. Instead, she found a man in a charcoal suit, his face as unyielding as the granite steps beneath his feet. He didn't look at her with the deference she demanded. He looked through her, as if she were a minor obstacle in a federal operation. "Mrs. Marshall?" he asked. The tone was professional, airless. "Yes?" Indira straightened her silk dress, her knuckles tightening on the doorframe. "We're in the middle of a private event. Whatever you're selling?" The man didn't blink. He held up a leather folder containing Federal Search and Seizure Warrant #992 Alpha. "Federal agents, we have a warrant to seize all digital and financial records associated with Caspian Vance and Aegis Logistics. This property is now a controlled site." Indira's hand gripped the doorframe so hard the wood groaned. She looked down at the warrant, her eyes frantically scanning the page for something, anything, to assert her dominance. She stopped at the line marked "Primary Property Owner." It didn't say Indira Marshall. It didn't say Thatcher Marshall. It said Nyleen Vance Marshall, CO, DOD Strategic Risk. The silence in the hallway was measurable. 4 seconds of absolute, airless shock. In the background, Caspian was frozen mid-toast, his champagne glass arrested in mid-air as he saw the badges behind the man at the door. He knew those badges. He knew the suits. And for the first time, he realized that the unstable sister he had been mocking wasn't a victim. She was the architect of the cage he had just walked into. I sat in my rocker miles away, watching the signal on my screen turn red. The world didn't end when I stopped being their anchor. It just finally started moving in the right direction. Tuesday, 8:30 p.m. In my line of work, we don't resolve conflicts with volume. We resolve them with data. As I prepared to leave Madigan, the air in the room was sharp with the ozone-like heat of a laser printer working through a 100-page queue. Sure clack. Sure clack. The sound was rhythmic, almost a heartbeat. I stood by the small hospital desk, my fingers tracing the edges of a heavy 3-ring binder. I wasn't preparing a speech. I was organizing a forensic audit of a 5-year betrayal. The preparation was a blur of tactical precision. I arranged the bank statements, the encrypted email threads, and the high-resolution screenshots of the group chats where my survival was debated like an administrative error. I used color-coded tabs, red for the $482,000 in diverted funds, blue for the medical insurance termination, and black for Caspian's recorded extortion. I felt the heat of the freshly printed paper against my fingertips, a physical weight for every time I had stayed silent to keep their glass house standing. My hands had a slight tremor, not from the lingering effects of the preeclampsia, but from the kinetic energy of a decade's worth of truth finally being bound into a single volume. Dr. Eris Thorne stood by the door, watching me snap the binder shut. He had seen the shock number on the final summary page. "Nearly $500,000, he said, his voice a low, clinical baritone. "And they called you a burden. Let the paper do the talking, Nyleen. You've carried their silence long enough." I didn't answer. I just adjusted the diaper bag on my shoulder and stepped toward the exit. As the elevator doors slid shut, my phone buzzed. It was a text from a cousin I hadn't spoken to since Gentry's last deployment. "Nyleen, everyone is so confused. Your mother is telling the guests you've had a complete postpartum breakdown. She says you're erratic and that Caspian is legally stepping in to protect the family assets from your confused state. Please tell me you're okay." The smear campaign had reached the arena before I did. Indira was gaslighting an entire social circle to discredit the witness before she could speak. It was a move born of entitlement, a tactical strike to frame my absence as a mental collapse rather than a survival. I didn't send a rebuttal. I just watched the rain trace crooked lines down the window of the medical transport as we approached Bellevue. The estate appeared through the gray mist like a velvet-draped courtroom. The driveway was a mirror of wet asphalt, crowded with valets and black SUVs. Inside, the string quartet was playing a Bach cello suite, the deep, mournful notes vibrating through the floorboards. The chandeliers cast jagged reflections in the champagne flutes of people who had come to witness a triumph and were about to witness an accounting. I entered the foyer with the binder tucked under my arm. The silence followed me into the ballroom like a cold draft. I was pale, my hospital ID band still hidden beneath the silk cuff of my coat, but my eyes were clear. Indira approached me first. She was wearing a silk gown that cost more than 3 months of my mortgage, a mortgage I was currently paying. She wore a pity smile for the benefit of the surrounding guests. "Oh, Nyleen, honey," she said, her voice loud enough to anchor the attention of the nearest circle. "We weren't expecting you. The doctor said you were so confused. Are you feeling clear today? Perhaps you should sit in the library while the adults finalize things." I didn't hug her. I didn't look for the mother who had hung up on me while I was blind on a kitchen floor. I looked at her with the same blank, analytical gaze I used to evaluate a compromised security perimeter. "Mrs. Marshall," I said, the formal address dropping like a stone in the center of the room. "I'm here for the truth, nothing more." The whispers started instantly. Erratic, breakdown, poor thing. Indira's smile didn't reach her eyes. It was a boundary she was trying to maintain. She turned to the crowd, her hand gesturing toward me as if I were a tragic exhibit. "She's been so sensitive since the accident. It's a tragedy, really. The mental toll of being alone." I didn't counter her with words. I just held the binder like a steering wheel, my knuckles white but steady. Across the room, I saw Gentry. He was standing near the fireplace, his charcoal suit making him look like a piece of the architecture. He didn't look like a soldier. He looked like the verdict. Caspian, in his blind arrogance, had cornered Gentry near the bar. Caspian assumed Gentry was the corrupt insider he'd been trying to bribe to clear his shell companies. He thought he was talking to an ally. I watched as Caspian leaned in, a glass of cristal in his hand, whispering to Gentry about how easy it had been to use Indira's greed and stupidity to shield the Aegis accounts. He thought he was confessing to a partner. He didn't see the silent authority in Gentry's eyes, or the digital recorder pinned to the inside of Gentry's lapel. Near the fireplace, a senior partner from Gentry's agency, a man of immense quiet power, caught my eye. He gave a single, imperceptible nod. The signal was sent. We had everything. Indira, sensing the mood shifting, decided to take control of the narrative. She walked to the center of the room and tapped her glass with a silver spoon. The quartet stopped. The room went airless. "Before our guest of honor, Caspian, speaks," Indira said, looking directly at me with a mask of false concern, "the family needs to address the unfortunate rumors regarding Nyleen's stability. We have to do what's best for the house. We have to protect our own." She drew a breath to deliver the final strike to my reputation. The guests leaned in, jurors waiting for the final word. The house I paid for was about to be used as a stage for my erasure. I stood there, silent, my name finally echoing in my own mind as the only truth that mattered. The banquet of lies was in full bloom by the time I adjusted the silk cuff of my coat, concealing the red plastic hospital band that still clung to my wrist. The quartet had transitioned to a lighter Vivaldi piece, the notes fluttering through the high ceilings of the Bellevue estate like the hollow laughter of the guests. I stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the rain-slicked driveway through the eyes of an analyst, not a daughter. I felt a strange, cold curiosity. I was watching them build the gallows with their own words, one brick of entitlement at a time. Indira stood in the center of the ballroom, a crystal flute of vintage cristal balanced perfectly between her fingers. She was performing the tragedy of Nyleen for a circle of attentive socialites. "It's a heartbreak, truly," she sighed, her voice carrying that practiced melodic grief. "My youngest, the hormones, the postpartum distress. She's been crafting these elaborate stories about her husband being on a classified mission just to cope with the reality of being alone. We're so lucky Caspian is here to help us manage the legal complications her instability has caused for the family trust." I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct her. I simply stood in the silence of my own presence, watching the guests nod with shallow, well-bred sympathy. I noted who avoided my eyes and who looked at me with that curdled pity. The silence I maintained was a tactical choice. It made the air in the room feel heavy, vacuum-sealed. In risk assessment, we call this the silent pressure, the moment before the integrity of a structure fails completely. The axis of the room shifted when Gentry walked in. He didn't enter through the front door. He seemed to materialize from the shadows of the foyer. He wasn't the low-level soldier they remembered in faded fatigues. He was in a charcoal suit that fit him like armor, moving with a predatory precision that brought the room to a rhythmic stop. Caspian, ever the narcissist who didn't realize he was being tracked, saw the suit and the posture and smiled. He thought the deal was being finalized. He thought Gentry was the corrupt DOD insider he had spent 18 months trying to bribe. Caspian stepped forward, his hand outstretched, the Rolex I had unwittingly subsidized catching the light of the chandelier. "Gentry," he said, his voice dripping with the easy confidence of a man who believes he owns the narrative. "Right on time. I assume you've brought the clearance for the Aegis accounts? We were just telling everyone how much the family appreciates your cooperation." Gentry didn't take the hand. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a federal shield. The music died mid-note. The silence that followed was absolute. "Caspian Vance," Gentry said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the weight of a closing cell door. He looked Caspian directly in the eye, then shifted his gaze to Indira and Eloan, who were frozen like statues in a museum of their own making. "Identity confirmed," Gentry said. "Arrest!" The hum of high-performance engines intensified outside as 4 more men in charcoal suits stepped through the doors. The perfect fiancé didn't scream. He simply deflated. His face went from a wealthy, tanned glow to a mottled, airless gray in 1.2 seconds. It was the first of the dead faces. "You can't do this!" Indira finally found her voice, the silk of her gown rustling as she stepped forward. "This is my house! You're trespassing! Thatcher, call the police!" Thatcher didn't move. He was looking at the lead agent, who had just produced a folder, the same one I had bound at the hospital. The agent turned to Indira, his expression clinical. "Ma'am, the title search conducted 12 hours ago shows this property was foreclosed due to tax delinquency 3 months ago. It was purchased through a foreclosure buyout by a private trust. Nyleen Vance Marshall is the sole trustee. You aren't the owner, Mrs. Marshall. You are a tenant whose unauthorized occupancy just ended." The social fallout was a chain reaction. Guests began to step back, physically distancing themselves from Indira and Eloan as if they were contagious. I walked to the mahogany table and placed the ledger down. I didn't say a word as the lead agent began to list the facts. The audit shows $32,000 in credit fraud against the trustee, $15,000 in unpaid property taxes covered by the trustee's private funds, and this, he held up the insurance denial form, the voluntary termination of medical coverage signed by Indira Marshall 24 hours before the trustee suffered a major medical crisis. The room went airless. I saw Aunt Margaret lower her glass. I saw the guests who had been nodding to Indira's lies now looking at the floor. The facts didn't need volume. The numbers were doing the work I had once done with my heart. I spoke only once. My voice was level, quiet, and carried no trace of the shaking woman I had been on that kitchen floor. "I spent 10 years analyzing risks for the Department of Defense," I said, looking at my parents. "My only failure was failing to analyze the risk of loving people who only saw me as a transaction. I didn't come here to ruin your party, Mom. I came here to close the account. You told me to drink orange juice while I was losing my sight and my child. From this moment on, you are no longer my family. You are simply a debt that has been cleared. That's the boundary." I looked at Eloan, whose perfect life was now a collection of evidence bags. I looked at Thatcher, who remained seated, staring at the red wine stain on the Persian rug. They were finally seeing me, but I was no longer looking for them. I picked up the diaper bag. I didn't wait for the apologies that would only ever be motivated by their sudden loss of access. I turned my back on the theater and walked out the front door into the rain. Gentry was waiting by the car, his hand on the door. I clicked the binder shut, the sound echoing in the empty, rain-slicked driveway like the final snap of a lock. After the SUVs pulled away from the Bellevue estate, the silence that settled over the house wasn't peaceful. It was a vacuum. The string quartet had vanished, leaving only empty chairs and the faint, lingering scent of expensive lilies. I watched from the medical transport as the guests began to slip away, their eyes averted, their polished social masks finally cracked. No one stopped to say goodbye to Indira. No one asked Thatcher for his opinion. The old order hadn't just been challenged, it had evaporated. The immediate void was the most honest thing that had ever happened in that house. Indira stood in the kitchen, still wearing her designer silk and her pearls, but her reflection in the darkened windows was that of a stranger. Eloin sat on the Persian rug, surrounded by bridal magazines that were now just expensive scrap paper. The golden child narrative was dead, and without it, they didn't know how to occupy the space. Thatcher sat on the porch, staring into the rain, finally realizing that the load-bearing wall he had spent 30 years kicking had finally moved out of reach. Over the next few weeks, the messages arrived. They weren't apologies, they were desperate attempts to reclaim the narrative. My mother's voicemails were high-pitched and frantic. "How could you humiliate us like that? Caspian was our future. You've destroyed your sister's life over a few bank errors. You are always so selfish, Nyleen." I didn't reply. I didn't send them the bank statements again or explain the federal law regarding fiduciary duty. Explaining the truth to people committed to a lie is a waste of analytical resources. I simply blocked the numbers. I didn't do it out of anger. I did it for signal clarity. I watched my phone screen turn dark, reflecting my own calm face, and I felt the weight of their expectations finally leave my marrow. The world didn't end when I stopped being their anchor. It just finally started moving in the right direction. 3 months later, the Seattle rain has been replaced by the rhythmic, expansive roar of the Pacific. We are in a cedar-shingled house on the Oregon coast, a place where the air tastes of salt and ancient timber. My son is asleep in my arms, his breathing a tiny, perfect engine of growth. Gentry is in the kitchen. The smell of fresh coffee is the only mission that matters today. He is no longer a shadow in my life, but the steady ground beneath it. I opened my laptop this morning and found the folder. Project Marshall. I looked at the files, the credit fraud, the insurance denial, the recordings. For months, these documents were my armor. Now they were just data from a closed case. I dragged the folder to the trash and clicked empty. The sound of the digital shredder was the only funeral my old life needed. I spent 30 years trying to be the foundation of a house that didn't want me. Now I've built my own. I don't need their recognition to know I exist. I am the architect of my own peace now. If you are listening to this and you are carrying a burden that was never yours to bear, if you are being told that your strength is a problem, know that you can set it down. It won't be loud. It'll just be quiet. The sun is coming up over the haystack rocks now, steady and inevitable. For the first time in my life, I am not just surviving. I am home.